What's the most disturbing secret your family kept? In my family, Great Uncle Thomas was a ghost we were allowed to talk about. The story was always the same, a tragic hunting accident when he was just 17. He was remembered as a bright, artistic kid with a love for the outdoors, a life cut tragically short. We had a single faded photo of him on a mantelpiece, forever young and smiling. Last year, my grandmother, now in her late 80s, finally decided to clear out the old farmhouse attic. Tucked away under a pile of moth-eaten quilts was a small, locked trunk. When I asked Grandma about it, a look I'd never seen before crossed her face, a flicker of pure panic. She claimed she'd lost the key ages ago. Later that night, curiosity got the best of me. A simple bobby pin was all it took. Inside, beneath pressed flowers and old letters, was her teenage diary. I flipped to the date after Thomas's death, my hands trembling. The pages were warped and stained with tears. The entry wasn't about a hunting accident. It described a terrible fight. Thomas had told his father, my great-grandfather, that he was leaving the farm to study art in the city. Great-grandpa, a man known for his harsh temper, refused. The diary read, "Papa didn't mean to push him so hard." Thomas had stumbled backward, his head on the stone fireplace hearth, and never got up. The last line was chilling. "We took him to the woods. We had to say it was the rifle." Suddenly, my grandmother's quiet, constant sadness made a different kind of sense. It wasn't just grief for a lost brother. It was the weight of watching her father become his killer and carrying that horrifying secret for over 60 years. My grandpa Gerald was a legend of normalcy. For 40 years, he was our small town's mailman. His passions were growing prize-winning roses and falling asleep during the evening news. He never traveled, hated having his picture taken, and lived a life so quiet and predictable that we all lovingly joked about it. When he passed away peacefully at 82, we mourned a simple, good man who had lived a simple, good life. While sorting through his belongings, I was tasked with clearing out his old metal filing cabinet in the basement. It was filled with decades of neatly organized tax returns and appliance warranties. But as I moved it, I felt a strange shift inside. The back panel was loose. I pried it open and found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a weathered leather wallet, but it wasn't his. I opened it and my blood ran cold. There was a complete set of identity documents, a driver's license, social security card, everything. The photo was undeniably my grandpa in his 20s, but the name was Richard McCann. The birth date and hometown were completely different. Beneath the ID were two brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings from 1968 from a city hundreds of miles away. They detailed a daring bank heist. Two men had gotten away, but one, a Richard McCann, had vanished with the entire score and was never caught. I just sat there on the dusty floor, staring at the proof. My grandpa's entire identity was a meticulously crafted lie. His boring, routine-obsessed life wasn't a personality. It was the perfect cover. The kindest, most predictable man I knew had spent over 50 years as a fugitive hiding in plain sight. My mom and her sister, Sarah, were a black hole in our family. They hadn't spoken a word to each other in 20 years, and no one would ever say why. Every holiday was a careful dance of separate celebrations. All I knew of my aunt was a few faded photos of two smiling sisters, frozen in a time before whatever happened happened. The official story was just, they don't get along. Last month, my mom was hospitalized with a pretty serious illness. While frantically searching her closet for insurance documents, I found an old lockbox. At the very bottom, beneath her birth certificate and other important papers, was a sealed envelope with my name on it in her familiar handwriting. The letter inside was dated 10 years ago. It began with, "If you are reading this, I'm not well enough to tell you myself." The words that followed ripped my world apart. The man I called Dad, the man who taught me to ride a bike and quizzed me for my driver's test, was not my biological father. In a moment of weakness just before her wedding, my mom had a one-night stand with Aunt Sarah's fiancé. That night was me. The revelation destroyed everything. The engagement was broken, and with it, the bond between the sisters. My aunt couldn't stand to look at me, the living, breathing proof of the ultimate betrayal. My dad, the hero of this story, found out and chose to stay, to raise me as his own without a moment's hesitation. I sat there on the floor, the letter shaking in my hands. The vague, shadowy conflict that had defined my family suddenly had a face, and it was mine. I wasn't just caught in the middle of their fight, I was the cause of it. My great-aunt Clara was the fun, eccentric one. Her house was a Victorian wonderland, famous in our family for being filled to the brim with dolls. They sat on every shelf, chair, and mantelpiece. We all just saw it as her harmless quirk. Clara is a collector, my mom would say with a shrug. As a kid, I loved visiting, but there was one rule. The little white door at the end of the upstairs hallway was always to remain locked. When she passed away at 90, I volunteered to help clear out her house. Sorting through her desk, I found a small, ornate key labeled nursery. My heart pounded. I knew which door it belonged to. Expecting just a room overflowing with more porcelain figures, I unlocked it and stepped inside. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a storage room. It was a perfectly preserved nursery frozen in time. A crib stood in the center, a rocking horse in the corner, tiny clothes folded neatly in a dresser. In the crib lay a single doll, but it was unlike the others. It was startlingly realistic, weighted and sized like a real infant. Propped on a lace pillow beside it was a framed birth certificate for a Michael, with a date from 1955. The date of death was just 2 days later. On a small table were photo albums I'd never seen. They showed a young, vibrant Clara, first glowing and pregnant, then cradling a newborn who looked exactly like the doll in the crib. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. She wasn't a collector. She was a mother, frozen for nearly 70 years at the moment her life fell apart. The entire house wasn't a collection. It was a shrine. And the family's accepted quirk was the quiet, lifelong scream of a grieving mother that no one ever heard. The story of my grandfather was the foundation of our family's pain. He was the villain, the selfish monster who walked out on my grandma and their young son, my dad, with nothing but a note. My grandmother, in turn, was the saint. She was the stoic, long-suffering woman who raised my father all on her own, never remarrying, never complaining. My dad carried a quiet, simmering rage for the man who left him, a resentment that shaped his entire life. When Grandma passed, it fell to my dad and me to sort through her house. In the back of her closet, buried under a mountain of old linens, my dad pulled out a heavy, dust-covered shoebox. He pried open the lid, and we both froze. It was packed with letters. Dozens and dozens of them, all unopened, all addressed to my dad in a man's handwriting. They were from my grandfather. My dad sat on the edge of the bed and opened the first one, dated the year his father left. It explained everything. He hadn't just abandoned them. He was gay. In their small religious town in the 1960s, he and my grandmother had made the gut-wrenching decision that he would disappear to spare the family from a ruinous scandal. His only condition was that he could still write to his son. The letters told a 30-year story of a father desperate to connect. There were birthday cards with cash still tucked inside, letters asking about his grades, his friends, his life. He sent photos of himself, told stories of his job in a faraway city, and in every single one, he told my dad he loved him and missed him. My grandmother had intercepted and hidden every last one. I watched my father, a man in his late 50s, completely shatter. The hatred he'd carried for a lifetime was for a man who never existed. The woman he had revered as a saint had not just lied to him, she had maliciously erased his father from his life. He wasn't just mourning his mother anymore. He was mourning the father he was never allowed to have. Growing up, we can't afford it was the unspoken motto of our family. My parents were the definition of frugal. We lived in a tiny house, I wore my cousin's hand-me-downs, and a big vacation was a day trip to the nearest state park. I learned to be grateful for what we had, but I always carried a quiet shame about being the poor kid and resented all the things I missed out on. I respected my parents for their sacrifices, but I swore I'd give my own kids a different life. When my dad died suddenly from a heart attack, a financial panic set in for my mom almost immediately. To help her sort things out, I offered to find his life insurance details. He'd recently started using online banking, and after finding the password in his desk, I logged into his account for the first time, expecting to see a few $1,000s at best. The number I saw on the screen made no sense. I had to count the commas twice. It was over $2 million. My hands started to shake. I clicked through the statements, my confusion turning into a cold, sickening horror. There were investment portfolios, high-yield savings accounts, and a transaction history showing a massive wire transfer from 25 years ago. It was an inheritance from a great uncle I barely remembered. All those years, all the stress, the arguments over bills, the shame. It was all a lie. We weren't poor. We were never poor. My father had been secretly sitting on a fortune my entire life. I looked over at my mom, who was nervously trying to calculate how she could afford the mortgage on her own. How could I even begin to tell her? Her hard-working, sacrificial husband wasn't who she thought he was. He was a man who chose to watch his wife and child struggle, hoarding wealth while his family reused tea bags. The respect I had for him evaporated, replaced by profound and baffling rage. The story of my paternal grandmother was a cornerstone of our family's history. A beautiful, vibrant woman who was tragically killed in a car crash when my dad was just a baby. The single wedding photo on my grandpa's desk showed a smiling bride, frozen in time. My grandpa, a figure of stoic grief, raised his son with the help of his late wife's sister, whom we all called Grandma Millie. She was the one we knew, the one who baked cookies and attended our school place. She was our grandmother in every way that mattered. After Grandpa passed away at 92, we began the somber task of clearing out his home. In the back of his study closet, behind a false panel, I found a small, heavy lockbox. Inside were two things: a stack of yellowed love letters tied with a ribbon, and a brittle newspaper clipping about the crash. My hands trembled as I read the letters. They were passionate, secret, and signed by Millie. They were written to my grandpa before he married her sister. Then I unfolded the newspaper clipping. My blood turned to ice. The article reported 2 victims in the crash, the 2 sisters. My grandmother, the woman from the wedding photo, had died instantly, but Millie had survived, thrown from the car and left with a severe head injury and total amnesia. The horrifying truth hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather, shattered by his wife's death and armed with the knowledge of his affair, had seen a monstrous opportunity. He went to the hospital and identified the survivor, the woman with no memory of who she was, as his wife. He switched their identities. The woman we knew as Grandma Millie, the woman who raised my father, wasn't a loving stand-in. She was an unwitting imposter who never knew her own name. My real grandmother was buried under a false identity, and my grandfather had built our entire family on a lie so cruel and profound it barely seemed real. In my family, you become a doctor. It's what we do. The tradition started with my great-grandfather, Dr. Alastair Finch, a man revered as a local saint. He founded our town's hospital back in the 40s, and his portrait still hangs in the lobby, a symbol of integrity and compassion. I'm in my 3rd year of medical school, driven by the desire to live up to that legacy. For a medical history assignment, I chose the obvious topic: Dr. Finch and the founding of Finch Memorial Hospital. The hospital board, proud of my connection, granted me access to the sealed archives from the early years. I was excited to uncover the details of his heroic work. Deep within dusty boxes of financial records, I found what I was looking for: his personal research logs. But as I read, a cold dread began to creep up my spine. The logs weren't a record of healing. They were a ledger of horrors. He wrote about his revolutionary techniques, but the subjects weren't his regular patients. They were the anonymous poor from the county workhouse, listed only by number. He had used them as human test subjects. The pages detailed experimental, often gruesome surgeries performed without proper consent or anesthesia, all to prove his methods were worthy of funding. He meticulously documented the many failures, the infections, the hemorrhages, the deaths, then cross-referenced them with the official hospital records, where he had falsified the causes of death as pneumonia or heart failure. The hospital wasn't built on philanthropy. It was built on the bodies of the forgotten. The man in the portrait wasn't a hero. He was a monster who valued his legacy over human life. Now, every time I walk into a lecture or put on my white coat, I feel like a fraud. My entire family history, the very reason I chose this path, is a lie soaked in blood. I've always been the odd one out in my family. My parents are quiet, bookish academics who think a thrilling evening is a documentary on pottery. I'm a loud, athletic, social butterfly. For years, my running joke was that I must have been switched at birth or secretly adopted. My parents would just laugh and shake their heads, a little too quickly, I realize now. The joke came to a crashing halt last week. I needed my original birth certificate to apply for a new passport. My parents got weirdly evasive, stalling for a day before my dad finally sat me down and handed me a thick manila folder. The birth certificate was on top. Underneath it were adoption papers, finalized when I was 3 days old. My world tilted. But as I sat there, stunned and hurt, my mom tearfully told me, "There's more." She pulled out a laminated newspaper clipping from the year I was born. The headline was about a notorious local cult that had been dismantled by police. The article detailed the fanatical tests of loyalty the members were subjected to. One story stood out. A young woman had been forced to abandon her newborn daughter on the steps of the local fire station to prove her devotion. I looked from the article to my parents, my heart hammering in my chest. "I was that baby," I whispered. They both nodded, their faces etched with 2 decades of fear. They were the social workers assigned to my case. Childless and desperate for a family, they fell in love with me instantly, pulling every string they could to legally adopt me and hide me from my past. My whole life suddenly snapped into focus. Their overprotective nature, their quiet home, their constant desire for a normal, uneventful life. It wasn't a personality trait. It was a shield they had been holding up for 20 years, desperately protecting the fire station baby from the shadow of the cult she was born into. My whole life, I've been terrified of water. Not just a mild dislike, a full-blown, panic-inducing phobia. Pools, lakes, even the deep end of a bathtub could trigger a cold sweat. My family never understood it. I never had a bad experience, never a close call. It was just an irrational, embarrassing quirk I had to live with, a constant source of confusion for me and everyone around me. Last Christmas, I was back at my parents' house, digging through the attic for old photo albums. I accidentally knocked over a dusty box, spilling a bunch of old 8mm film reels. On a whim, I cleaned off my dad's old projector and threaded one of the unlabeled reels. It wasn't a holiday or a birthday party. It was a summer barbecue at a lake house. I watched grainy footage of my aunts and uncles laughing, my dad at the grill, and then I saw myself. A tiny, waddling toddler in a sun hat, maybe 2 years old. As the adults talked, I toddled right to the edge of the dock. And then I was gone. I vanished under the dark water. For what felt like an eternity, a solid 15 or 20 seconds of the film, nobody noticed. The party just continued. Then I saw my uncle's head whip around, his face contorting in horror. He screamed and dove in. The camera, presumably dropped, spun wildly before capturing the final chaotic image, my uncle pulling my limp, blue-tinged body out of the water. Then the film went black. I sat there in the dusty attic, my own breathing ragged. When I went downstairs and confronted my parents, the story spilled out between sobs. I had stopped breathing. My dad had to perform CPR. The event was so horrifying for the entire family that they collectively decided to bury it, to never speak of it again, assuming I was too young to have any memory of it. They were wrong. The memory was always there, locked away in the deepest part of my mind, screaming at me my entire life. My phobia wasn't irrational. It was the perfectly rational echo of the day I drowned.